Alrighty, we are starting in on Anne Bradstreet, nearing the end of this colonial period, basically from the first decade of the 1600s to the 1750s, maybe as late as the 1760s. And let's jump into a few key moments in her life. So she's born in 1612 in England, to a fairly wealthy upper class family. She receives an excellent education. They're Puritans. When she's 16 years of age, she gets married to a man that works with her father, who's also a Puritan, Simon Bradstreet. Only 2 years later, she's 18. The whole family sails with John Winthrop, the Massachusetts Bay Colony. I think they arrive originally maybe in Salem, I want to say, a little bit north of Boston, just a little bit. But then basically the members, she's on the ship Arbella, and they end up in Boston, and they move around, as it says, the next timeline thing there. It says settled in northeastern Massachusetts along the Merrimack River. Well, they were in Boston, then they moved just across the river to Cambridge, or what was then called Newtown, then up to Ipswich, and finally in the 1640s to 20 miles north of Boston, North Andover, basically. In 1650, her first book of poetry, The Tenth Muse, Lately Sprung Up in America, published in England, in London, by her brother-in-law. So that's in 1650. This is her sister's name, I think, is Mercy Bradstreet, married John Woodbridge. So he publishes the poetry. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Another important moment in 1666, her home is destroyed by fire. We'll see that. That's just a couple of months before the Great Fire in London. Good. So, and then just as a reminder, of course, Bradstreet is a Puritan, member of a group of English Protestants who advocated strict religious discipline, purification of the Church of England from its Catholic heritage. And great. So there in bullet item number 1, we see just a little bit about where her and her husband and her many children moved in Massachusetts. So item number 2 there. So her father, Thomas Dudley, became her husband and her father, both very important people who were involved in the early colonial government. Her father, Thomas Dudley, became the second colonial governor. I think he was governor many times for short periods of a year. After Anne Bradstreet died in 1672, her husband, who outlived her, would later also become governor as well. Her husband, Simon Bradstreet, was, even before he became governor in the late 1670s, he was the secretary for the colonial government, so an important, basically like a cabinet position. And he was, when they were living in Andover, he was often away from her on business, down to Boston, sometimes even back to England, leaving her for, pretty long period of time, which you can see in some of her poems about to my husband absent upon public employment, things like that. So the second edition of her poetry is published in Boston in 1678, and it's pretty clear that she was revising her poetry and maybe preparing them for publication, even though that second edition didn't happen until after she was dead. But it's pretty clear that she revised a lot of her work in preparation for that. She was influenced there by Edmund Spenser and Sir Philip Sidney. Edmund Spenser and Philip Sidney are both Elizabethan poets. Of course, Spenser wrote The Faerie Queen, and Philip Sidney was a poet, soldier. She loved her some Sidney. I think maybe also because he was a soldier as well, and he died literally fighting Catholic Spain when he was only 31. So those are her influences, Spenser and Sidney. And then this is important, and this comes from the Norton Anthology of American Literature in the excellent biographical introduction, where they mention that Bradstreet herself influenced very important 20th century American poets, and the three they name there are John Berryman, Susan Howe, and Adrienne Rich. And this is a really important point I want to talk about for just a moment, because one of the, probably I'd say one of the most important qualities of a poet is how much are they read, after their death. Maybe, a significant time after they've died, who's reading them, and are other poets reading them? Because, so I've said before that Michael Wigglesworth, who is usually included oftentimes in readings of this colonial period, his book was published in, I believe, 1662, huge, basically an international bestseller. I would argue that it's doesn't have as much literary value, Wigglesworth's poetry, that it doesn't have as much literary value as Bradstreet, and that would be just like looking at the poems themselves, and also in some way like, do later poets read them? And why is that important? Because later poets are reading people that inspire them, whose craft they love, whose craft they admire. And so the three people that are listed in the Norton introduction, John Berryman, Susan Howe, and Adrienne Rich, all very, very important poets in the 20th century. And also importantly, although I don't think it mentions this, they're all poets that are associated with very different styles. So John Berryman associated with the confessionalist movement, and Susan Howe, a very, very different type of poet than Berryman. Susan Howe is often, Berryman's long dead. Susan Howe is still alive, and Susan Howe has often been associated with the, quote, language poets, which is basically sort of a postmodern movement. And both, like Berryman and Susan Howe are both amazing poets in their own right, and so different from each other. So it's very interesting that they were influenced by her, as was Adrienne Rich, probably the most important of those three poets there. And so I'm going to read just a little bit of a quotation from what Adrienne Rich says about Bradstreet and why Bradstreet was so important to Adrienne Rich. So this is a little excerpt from an essay, I think from the late 1970s. Again, this is by Adrienne Rich, and it's about her feelings about Bradstreet. So, reading and writing about Bradstreet, I began to feel that furtive, almost guilty spark of identification so often kindled in me, in those days, by the life of another woman writer. There were real parallels between her life and mine. Like her, I had learned to read and write in my father's library. Like her, I had known the ambiguities of patronizing compliments from male critics. Like her, I suffered from chronic lameness. But above all, she was one of the few women writers I knew anything about who had also been a mother. So that's really important. And then Adrienne Rich goes on to talk a little bit about the tension that she felt from Bradstreet, in Bradstreet's writing, the tension between creative work, between your writing and motherhood, that the difficulty of not only just the time, but just as she says, that it's this tension that feels, but it's also a productive thing as well. So, and actually that's going to lead us, so again, just I think it's important to know that she's somebody that's still read, not just by students in college class, Bradstreet. She's not just read by students in college classes, but she's read by people who are writing poetry even now. I saw something recent, some published poet who was, I think it was either a blog entry or a nonfiction essay about writing. It's not very much in vogue anymore, nor has it been for a long time, to write rhyming poetry, or at least to publish it. And this person that I had recently read was talking about the influence of Bradstreet, how that helped her to shift back into that. So, but that tension that Adrienne Rich, notices there. Let's dive into that tension, and we'll look at the very first poem that I want to look at. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 poems and a letter of Bradstreet's, and I'm going to assume that you don't have any knowledge, or that you haven't read Bradstreet before. So, and one of the things I want to do is not only notice maybe the subtleties and the skill and, why she's an important poet and what's very deep about her, but also appreciate her. And so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with this, the author to her book, which is a very accessible poem, and it's fun. It's still it's a great poem, even though it's not necessarily the most deep. So we'll go into this. So the author to her book, written in heroic couplets. Those, of course, are rhyming pairs of iambic pentameter. And we'll dive right in. And the highlighted part here is just the halfway point in the poem. It's after line 12. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view. So obviously the title, she's writing to her book, but so the story of how her first book was published in London in 1650. Let's pause for a moment so I can unpack that just a little bit. So, and as Adrienne Rich pointed out a moment ago, one of the things that she felt she had in common with Bradstreet was, I think Rich said something about learning to read or write in my father's library. Well, Bradstreet, when she was a little girl, she always loved her father. When she was a little girl, she would write poetry for him, kind of as an expression of love and, wanting affection and things like that, in a very healthy, really beautiful way. Her father was kind of a stern Puritan, but a loving man as well. And so even as an adult then, when everyone's in America, she often wrote her poetry with her father in mind, and there were copies of a great many of her poems in her father's home. And so when we read that, in 1650, her brother-in-law, Bradstreet's brother-in-law, John, took her poems without her consent and had them published in London, there's just a smidge of uncertainty about whether or not he had her, consent to do that, or her knowledge. It used to always be that we thought that she knew nothing about it, and there's some evidence for that. But there, I think fairly recently, like in the last couple of decades, there's maybe a letter that she wrote to him when he was over there, which suggests that she did know that he was publishing her work. So I think that's a little bit, well, it doesn't really matter too much. But so this is playing with the idea, and it was a convention also, especially for women writers, to assume this modesty and, I didn't really mean to publish this, let's do it anyway, sort of thing. And so that's not an uncommon thing, but that's sort of the foundation for where this is coming from. Okay, let's go to line 8. My rambling brat in print should mother call, I cast thee by as one unfit for light. Thy visage was so irksome in my sight, yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. And I just highlighted there because there are 24 lines in this poem, and Bradstreet is very, very skillful. She's a master with shifting her subject matter at different points, dramatizing certain things. So literally right smack in the middle of this poem, it's like we'll watch often in her poetry, we'll notice her shifting her thinking process. It's really like a reflection of her thinking process, especially in her religious poetry, about her reflection on God and her duty toward him, etc. So line 13, I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet. So the little pun there in line 15, even feet, the feet of children, but also the feet as in the meter of her verse. Yet still thou runst more hobbling than is meet. And you could kind of stretch that out and make it, make the syllable count, make it have too many syllables so that it kind of matches what she's doing there. In a better dress to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth of the house I find. In this array amongst vulgars mayst thou roam, in critics' hands beware thou dost not come. So it's a great line there, and she's one of thousands of poets who are quite concerned, anxious, and even sometimes angry at the notion of like what critics are going to say, what literary critics are going to say about their poetry, one of my favorite lines in poetry about critics comes from Frank O'Hara, the fabulous poet from the 1950s and 60s, American poet Frank O'Hara, and he has a poem entitled "The Critic," and the line that he uses is something like, "I'll say you for what you are, the assassin of my orchard." So, for O'Hara, thinking of literary critics, he thought of them as the assassin of his orchard, of his work. And anyway, so she has a similar a feeling there, like, beware of critics, and take thy way where yet thou art not known. If for thy father asked, say thou hadst none. For thy mother she... Now, so there's obviously this humility and modesty that we're going to see in this, and also in the next one. Although in the next one, when we look at the prologue, we'll see that she sneaks in these sort of things that undermine maybe a sort of traditional worldview, and maybe even lead to, sometimes she's called the first feminist poet. And we'll see why. And maybe even there with that line 22, if for thy father asks, say thou hadst none. So her poetry, her book there, the author to her book, she's also, there's just a little bit of I think a signal of like some hidden strength there. You didn't have a father. This is solely the product of a woman, and for thy mother she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of doors. So, lovely, and we will move on to the prologue, one of the most well-known poems of hers, and before we do, let's just take a look at so what we've got here. So in that poem that we just looked at, the author to her book, we might say that the central conceit, conceit just being a term especially used for metaphysical poetry, the late 1500s, early 1600s, John Donne, other English writers. Conceit being the extended metaphor that covers the entire poem, the extended metaphor. And so the extended metaphor here is that she's playfully conflating the role of mother and writer, obviously. Now, and then we'll shift into the prologue in just a moment. And so, as it says here, just on the surface, about the prologue and the author to her book, that both poems demonstrate a Puritan morality lesson. The modesty and humility outweigh extravagance and pride, and that's true. However, as we look at the prologue, we'll see that there's something a little bit deeper going on. So, but there are 8 stanzas here, and I don't want to go through each one, but maybe about half of them or so, in order to make sure we understand this. So, now I have a feeling that in the very beginning of this, she's doing, it's something that I will say that Whitman does in his poem, Song of Myself, in the 1850s through the 1880s, when he published a Song of Myself at the beginning, which is that maybe both of them are playing off of, in the first couple of lines, playing off of the start or the typical beginning of epic poetry. So epic poetry being especially things, like the Aeneid, the Odyssey, the Iliad, things written by Virgil and Homer. And so in all of those epic poems, the beginning of them, she says here in the first 2 lines, to sing of wars, of captains and of kings, of cities founded, commonwealths begun. So maybe she's referencing the beginning. I'll just read quickly what the first lines are of some of those poems. The Aeneid begins, I sing of warfare and of man at war, from the seacoast of Troy in early days. So Virgil's Aeneid is literally about a city being founded, about the founding of Rome, the Roman Empire. Homer's Iliad, being about the war between the Greeks and the Trojans. Rage, sing goddess, sing of Achilles' rage, black and murderous that cost the Greeks. And then in Homer's Odyssey begins, sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns. So in all of those, there's a familiar way to begin this. And I think that Bradstreet is playing off of that and and then immediately dispensing it. dispensing with that need to write of such grand ideas of epic poetry, like, important people like Achilles or Odysseus or the founding of the Roman Empire. Line 3, for my mean pen, mean being humble, for my humble pen are two superior things. Or how they all, or each their dates have run, let poets and historians set these forth. My obscure lines shall not so dim their worth. Let's, as I said, I don't want to go through every line, or every stanza. Let's skip to 3 here. From schoolboy's tongue no rhetoric we expect. So again, what we're going to notice is this real modesty, especially in the first maybe half of the poem. And then by stanza 5, when we get into the second half, she'll just make these nice little sort of inroads and maybe subvert our expectations of a Puritan poet and of a woman Puritan poet. So from schoolboy's tongue no rhetoric we expect, nor yet a sweet consort from broken strings, nor perfect beauty wears a main defect. And so she's using the idea of the very antiquated, very misogynist 17th century notion that women are weaker, they're not as smart, etc. So she's taking all of those tropes and using those. Nor perfect beauty wears a main defect, my foolish, broken, blemished muse so sings. And this to mend, alas, no art is able, 'cause nature made it so irreparable. So, okay, let's go to section 5, where she gives maybe a little bit more of a rebuke in some ways about the very ideas which she was sort of putting forth. I am obnoxious to each carping tongue who says my hand and needle better fits. A poet's pen I'll scorn I should thus wrong. For such despite they cast on female wits, colon. So what she's saying is this is what people say about women poets. If what I do prove well, it won't advance. They'll say it's stolen, or else it was by chance. So she's saying if her work is great, if her verse is wonderful, then people, especially men, are going to say they're going to say, oh, it was stolen, or it was by chance. So again, she's just making these sort of slight, maybe slightly subversive comments here. And then we'll just look at the last 2 stanzas here. Let Greeks be Greeks and women what they are. Men have... So now she doesn't go too strong with her, what I would say, I'm going to say in the next slide, where I give a nice sort of overview of the analysis and the significance of this poem. I am going to use the word feminist, that there's a slight strain of feminism in here. But she cannot go over the top with that. I don't think she really wants to, or that she really feels that anyway. But she couldn't because of the way women were treated. And Anne Hutchinson was actually, thrown out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and her father, Governor Dudley, had a hand in that. So it's not like she could be a completely subversive element, and I don't think that was her nature anyway. But anyway, men have precedency and still excel. It is but vain and justly to wage war. Men can do best and women know it well. Preeminence in all and each is yours. So again, very humble, very modest, especially about gender roles. But then this very important little line here, yet grant some small acknowledgement of ours. So just carving out a little bit of space, a little bit of self-agency for her as a woman and as a writer. And O ye high-flown quills that soar the skies, and ever with your praise still catch your praise, if e'er you deign these lowly lines your eyes, give thyme or parsley wreath, I ask no bays. So she's not asking for, the traditional laurel wreaths for, like a Roman poet. She makes this sort of joke about give me thyme or parsley, herbs for cooking. This mean and unrefined ore of mine will make your glistering gold more to shine. Okay, wonderful. And let's go back to the slide really quick and see what I've got down. So again, what I write there is that both poems demonstrate this sort of Puritan morality viewpoint. Modesty and humility outweigh extravagance and pride. But what's very important, and what I would say is the significance of the prologue, is right here. And so by significance, what I mean there is rather than just the summary of it, or even like we looked at in the author to her book, the conceit, which is the extended metaphor. For me, the significance means what makes this important. What's the deeper analytical substance to the poem? What do we get from the prologue on a second reading, on a third reading where we really dive into it? And then what I suggest is that the subtext of the poem is a feminist notion that slightly undermines traditional masculine notions of war and heroism as the proper subject matter. She skillfully suggests women have an important voice within the patriarchal culture. So that's a good way to think about the significance. And as I say there, the subtext of the poem is is a feminist notion. So I think it's a good way to think. Is she, the first feminist poet? Probably, yes. Just in a very subtle way. One might even say that there are hints of feminism in here, like in the same way that if you read on the bottle of red wine, there's hints of blackberry. You don't expect it to be sweet like blackberry. You're just going to taste a little hint of it. And so there's just a little hint of feminism in here. So wonderful. Next, we're going to look at a beautiful poem. Here follows some verses upon the burning of her house, July 10th, 1666. So her house burned down, completely burned down. We'll see that in the poem in just a moment. And, she lost her home. She lost, they also had, as a writer, she had, I think it's estimated that they had like 800 books in their library, just an enormous amount. And they lost most or all of them. So the third, so these are couplets in iambic tetrameter as opposed to pentameter. Iambic pentameter being the sort of granddaddy and the most important type, the most important way to write English poetry, the most popular, most skillful. So iambic tetrameter is where this is. And actually, because of that, because it's not pentameter, because it's tetrameter, it's actually easier to write like this. Like if you wanted to write thinking about in rhyming or in meter, this is you look at this poem, and this is a great way to model. If you wanted to write in a rhyme, you could model yourself on this. So let's look at it. And okay, great. So and then what I would say about this poem is that this is, as I think I've probably mentioned before, I said a few minutes ago something about Wigglesworth maybe not being having as much literary value. I said something about that when I was talking about the poets that Bradstreet influenced, Berryman, Howe, Adrian Rich, etc. People aren't still poets, aren't still reading Michael Wigglesworth like they are Bradstreet. Now, what I also want to point out is that in this poem, we see that there is genuine religious faith here. She's a Puritan, she's a Christian, and this is an expression of her faith. And I want to differentiate. This is an excellent work of literature, and it expresses her faith as well. So that's different than Wigglesworth or lots of other writers who when they're writing about their faith, it doesn't matter if it's a Christian, Jew, Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever. If you write about your faith in sort of a shallow way, or maybe even if you have a shallow experience of faith, as a religious person, then your writing's not going to be good. But Bradstreet's is excellent, and I think the poem is too. In silent night when rest I took, for sorrow near I did not look, I wakened was with thundering noise, and piteous shrieks of dreadful voice, that fearful sound of fire and fire. Let no man know is my desire. And you can see how it's really easy to sort of get into this rhythm. And I did this myself when I was a senior in college. I was taking an American Lit course, and it was early American Lit. I was taking it sort of late as a senior, and so I was reading this, but I was also taking a 400 level creative writing class, and I ended up writing, kind of experimenting, basing some poems on Bradstreet herself. It's really just easy to let that kind of flow out. I, starting up the light, did spy, and to my God my heart did cry to strengthen me in my distress, and not to leave me succorless. Then coming out beheld a space, the flame consumed my dwelling place. And when I could no longer look, I blessed his name that gave and took. And I think probably in the footnotes to the Norton, the printed footnotes, there's something about that, obviously a biblical reference to the first chapter of Job. The Lord giveth and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. So there's just a little allusion there in that line to that. Great. Line 15. That laid my goods now in the dust. Yea, so it was, and so 'twas just. It was his own, it was not mine. Far be it that I should repine. He might of all justly bereft, and yet sufficient for us left. Now here in line 22 is where line 21, this is why you can see that Bradstreet is really good, because so all that's been fine so far, and now what does she do? Good poetry. It doesn't matter if it's by Bradstreet or anybody else, British, American, world poetry, whatever. Good poetry is always going to have, it's always going to be founded on things. They're, you've got to be able to see it and feel it and think about it, and the reader needs to be familiar with it. So she's going to bring up material things, and that really gives it a great grounding here in the middle part of the poem. So, when by the ruins oft I passed, my sorrowing eyes aside did cast, and here and there the places spy, where oft I sat and long did lie. So, after the fire, when she is walking by the ruins of her home, she looks and she remembers these things. And this is what I was talking about objects, about things that are in this world. Here stood that trunk, and there that chest. There lay that store I counted best. My pleasant things in ashes lie, and them behold no more shall I. Under thy roof no guest shall sit. So again, very very homey in a way. Nor at thy table eat a bit. No pleasant tale shall e'er be told, nor things recounted done of old. No candle e'er shall shine in thee. No bridegroom's voice e'er heard shall be. And then here's going to be another allusion. This to Ecclesiastes, all is vanity. In silence ever shall thou lie. Adieu, adieu, all's vanity. Now, after that perfect move where she brings up all of these things, things of this world, we might say, things of this world, the trunk, the different things in her home, thinking about all the time she had dinner there, that she had guests, etc. All that's gone, adieu, adieu, all's vanity, and this beautiful little subtle allusion to Ecclesiastes there. And then it shows her thinking process, as a lot of great poems do. You can see the authors, basically their metacognitive process within the poem itself. And for her, that's her faith. And straight I get my heart to chide, and did thy wealth on earth abide? Did fix thy hope in mouldering dust? The arm of flesh did make thy trust? Raise up thy thoughts above the sky, that dunghill mists away may fly. Thou hast an house on high erect, framed by that mighty architect. Now, by the way, let's say you're not a religious person at all. I think that you can, it's so easy for us to be jaded as American and just, people in 2021. It's very easy to be jaded. But it's important to recognize when someone is just being very, very genuine in, I would say, in a sweet and lovely way, but that almost trivializes what she's doing, because her vulnerability and her honesty here is just powerful, I would say. So let's go with line 45 there. With glory richly furnished, stands permanent though this be fled. It's purchased and paid for too, obviously. So she's made this comparison between her earthly possessions in her house, which are all gone, and then the reflection on that as a Puritan makes her think about, well, where does the real value of life exist? Well, for her, it exists in a relationship with God. And so then she takes in these lines here, she literally, it's like a rhetorical process where she's asking these questions and making herself sort of think. And that, such a great line, 41, raise up thy thoughts above the sky. Okay, let's go jump down to line 48. By him who hath enough to do, a price so vast as is unknown, yet by his gift is made thine own. There's wealth enough, I need no more. Farewell my pelf, farewell my store. The world no longer let me love. My hope and treasure lies above. Beautiful. Great. So let's move on here, and we're going to look next at the letter that she left for her dear children, and just look at a couple kind of important and powerful passages here. And we'll just maybe kind of think about this in preparation. So again, to my dear children, this is a letter instructing and reminding them as she's close to dying. She's instructing and reminding them about what's important to her, about her faith that she wants to, encourage in them. And the letter itself is so interesting because she's honest and she explains doubt. And so we might just kind of think as we get into the letter, what does Bradstreet say fills her with the greatest belief in God, and how is that maybe a little surprising for a Puritan? So keep that in mind as we actually look into it. Okay, great. So okay, great. We want to skip down to, and there are a couple things I highlighted here just because that's where I want to look at the places where this, and by the way, there are so many times when you're reading literature, when I'm teaching literature, that I decide, especially with poets, let's look at their letters, because especially with poets, when we have their letters, we can see how brilliant they are, how brilliant their thought processes are, often how true and honest they are, and how skillful they are. So that's why I want to look at hers. I do that with Keats as well, with John Keats. In one of his letters, he makes an almost offhand comment, and it ends up being one of the most widely considered concepts in English poetry, and he discusses negative capability, the capacity for sort of being in a state or writing about something or having an artistic experience or a literary experience and not needing immediate resolution. He calls that negative capability. And when we get to Dickinson, whenever I teach Emily Dickinson, I start out with her letters to Thomas Wentworth Higginson, because we can see, and we will in this course, we will see how Dickinson, writing to somebody she doesn't know, who's a powerful literary critic and editor, and he's about ready to, I don't think he's quite gone into the Civil War yet because it's 1862, but he'll be he's just this very intriguing, very dynamic, very impressive person. And in one letter to him, she doesn't know him at all, Dickinson will send him one letter, and it'll kind of almost like bring him to his knees, and she'll manipulate him, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but she'll convince him that she is somebody very important, and he'll try to come visit her. Well, he will come visit her. So it's always great to see, to look at poets' letters, and so let's do that now with Bradstreet. So she talks a little bit about her sickness. She had smallpox. She probably had tuberculosis at the end of her life. And then I think this is so, she writes about her questions and her doubts as a Christian. And she puts them so, they're just so well written here. But as I grew to about 14 or 15, I found my heart more carnal. Actually, I don't think there's any better way that one could express, regardless of whether a person is religious or not, what happens when you become a teenager. As I grew to be about 14 or 15, I found my heart more carnal and sitting loose from God. Vanity and the follies of youth take hold of me. He smites her with smallpox, etc. After a short time, my condition was, After a short time, I changed my condition, was married, and came into this country. And by the way, this is really powerful. And sometimes people read this improperly. They think that she was really happy to get here. But no, she says that in the most concise way possible, she is basically saying that, she came here with her parents and with her husband in 1630. She's only 18 years of age, and did not like it at all. She's a woman that was brought up in a wealthy upper class household, and all of a sudden she and all of her family are moving to the friggin' wilderness. I changed my condition and was married, and I came into this country where I found a new world and new manners. Again, very concise. at which my heart rose. And so to be clear, she's not saying she's happy at which my heart rose is I was not pleased. But after I was convinced it was the way of God, I submitted to it and I joined the Church of Boston. So great. Let's skip on down just a little bit here. And this is a really interesting portion of the letter, which we're going to look at right now. Okay, beginning with many times hath Satan. Great way to begin a paragraph. Many times hath Satan troubled me concerning the verity of the scriptures, many times by atheism. How I could know whether there was a God? I never saw any miracles to confirm me, and those which I read of, how did I know? But they were feigned. So again, what I'm kind of pointing out in this letter, which is the overall letter is very much a declaration of her faith, but it's also a sort of almost like a little bit of an autobiographical statement about how her faith changed. And to my mind, what I would say is maybe the most important or impressive thing about someone describing their faith is them describing their doubt. How do you, if you are a religious person, how do you wrestle with doubt? And so here's where she goes into that. The third line down right here. That there is a God, my reason would soon tell me. Now, I asked at the beginning of this, back in the original slide, what does she say, what does Bradstreet say, is the most important reason that she believes in God? Now, think about it. You can come up with all kinds of reasons. You could be, you could say, I just know. Or you could say, because of Scripture, or because of this, that, and this. So what does Bradstreet say in her own words, I'm asking, what does she say is the most important thing that helps her to believe in God? That there is a God, my reason would soon tell me by the wondrous works that I see, the vast frame of the heaven and the earth, the order of all things, night and day, summer and winter, spring and autumn, the daily providing for this great household upon the earth, the preserving and directing of all to its proper end. So when she says this, and I think that they quote this in the biographical introduction to Bradstreet in the Norton Anthology, they say something along the lines of that she is the first of a long line of American poets. We'll get to some more of them in just a little bit. Emerson, Thoreau, Whitman. She's the first in a long line of poets whose belief in a higher being is bound to, what is she saying here? The wondrous works? Well, that's nature. That's like going, for a walk, going for a beautiful walk down along Manderson Landing and the river walk and seeing the Black Warrior River and, the trees overhead and everything's beautiful. And those are the wondrous works, the vast frame of the heaven and the earth. And then, the shifting of the seasons and how things all sort of play out. It's a stretch for me to say that, but because we'll be getting into Emerson fairly soon, it's almost like this prefigures that in some way just a little bit. But it's nature. It's her experience in nature that gives her this, provides the foundation of her belief. Now, look at what she says here in this line. But how should I know that he is such a God as I worship in Trinity, and as a Savior as I rely upon? So she talks a little bit there about how, she's troubled by that notion, and then she resolves it, and then we look down at this. This will be the last part of this letter. When I have got over this block, then have I another put in my way, that admit this be the true God whom we worship, and that be his word, yet why may not the popish religion be right? So the popish religion, what she's saying there is a Puritan, she's saying, oh, wait a second, how do I know that the God that I am worshiping is the true God? Don't Catholics also, as she says right here in this next line, again, she's referring to Catholics, they have the same God, the same Christ, the same word. They only interpret it one way, we another. So all of these different things which have troubled her or, that she's wrestled with, and I think that she identifies them in very intelligent ways. And then she dismisses Catholicism in the very next paragraph very quickly. And actually, there were a few times in writing where she was rather anti-Catholic. I think there was a line of hers, something like she refers to Catholicism as Rome's whore. So anyway, so very important to my dear children letter. We'll look at the last thing that I want to look at is a short, fabulous poem of hers on the death of her grandchild. And good. So right there, that was the last sort of question that we wanted to look at there with Bradstreet. And that's something that you can write about in an essay, in the midterm, discussion board post. How does Bradstreet, what does Bradstreet say fills her with the greatest belief in God? We looked at that passage. And then that question, how might this be surprising for a Puritan? All right, great. So now let's look at her, this poem about her, grandchild. This is it's easy to tell what this poem is about, but now this poem is going to be kind of deep, and again, it's got some of that subtlety and complexity that I like in the prologue, and it's just such a well-written poem. Okay, so it's about her dear grandchild, Elizabeth Bradstreet, who died when the little grandchild was only a year and a half old. And what we're going to notice here in these two stanzas is that there are basically going to be two parts in each of the two stanzas, so we can take a look at this is going to be one sort of part one, and then this will be part two there. Let's put that there. Okay, great. So, farewell, dear babe, my heart's too much content. Farewell, sweet babe, the pleasure of mine eye. Farewell, fair flower, that for a space was lent, then ta'en away unto eternity. Now, we'll just kind of notice this shift. Blessed babe, why should I once bewail thy fate, or sigh thy days so soon were terminate, sit thou art settled in an everlasting state? So she asks a question there. A great way to proceed in a poem is to, the speaker is asking themselves a question and then sort of ruminating on it, coming up with something. And now let's look at this different stanza 2. By nature, and think about just in these first 4 lines, what are the images? And if we were to say, well, there's one sort of thematic element in stanza 1, what would that be if we could, just use one word to describe stanza 1? And what would be the one word for stanza 2, especially in the first 4 lines? By nature, trees do rot when they are grown, and plums and apples thoroughly ripe do fall, and corn and grass are in their season mown, and time brings down what is both strong and tall. So think about all of the things that she wrote there in those first 4 lines, and maybe I would say they're all nature images, right? And she just starts off, line 1 of section 2, by nature. Now, not only are they nature images, but I think there's just this sort of subtle, reference to the Hebrew scriptures, or, for her, the Old Testament here. When you mention a tree, line 1, and an apple, well, there's a little bit of maybe a subtext there of Eve, tree and apple, and then corn and grass, and then corn is used oftentimes in the King James Version of the Bible. That's just the word that's used to describe, fields of corn, just meaning any sort of crop. So again, there's it's nature imagery, and maybe even just a little bit of biblical nature imagery as well. Time brings down what is both strong and tall, but plants new set to be eradicate, and buds new blown to have so short a date, is by his hand alone that guides nature and fate. Now, what I love about this poem, so it takes a couple of reads, I think, to get to this, and then I asked, well, what is the subject matter if we could reduce all of stanza 1 to a word? I think it would probably be fate. And so we're also going to see down here at the end, we're going to see nature and fate come again. So I think what she's doing here, stanza 1, we see her kind of playing with this idea. So first of all, just the first 4 sections, she's saying, how much she loved her grandchild. And then she asks this question, why should I bewail thy fate? Section 2, she gives all these things. Now, look at what she's doing. In the last 3 lines, she's being, on the one hand, maybe she's expressing a sort of Puritan view, which she is. She says, so when she says, plants new set to be eradicate, and buds new blown to have so short. So what she's doing, just to be clear, in case it's a little hard to follow, is she's saying, well, listen, in nature, trees only rot when they're fully grown. In nature, plums and apples only fall down when they're ripe. Corn and grass are in their season mown. So all of these things, she's comparing that, she's contrasting that to her beautiful little grandchild who was taken away from her at the age of 1.5, which is not fair, which is not right, which isn't in its own season. Then those last three lines: plants new set to be eradicate and buds new blown to have so short a date. So she's saying when things are taken away, when living things are taken away so quickly, last line, then why are they taken away? Because by his hand alone that guides nature and fate. Now, so what you can do on the surface level reading with that is it's very easy to say, well, it's, she's a Puritan and she's just acknowledging that the omnipotent God guides everything. He guides nature and fate. But now also I think that there's just a little bit of a complication there because when, as she's mentioned, when something is taken away too soon, and when it's the only way that it could have been taken away, her, little grandchild, Elizabeth, then it's because of God. And so there's this very subtle questioning there, like basically why would God do this? So in this slide, so what I've got here is just again, fate being juxtaposed with images of nature, so that's how we can analyze it. And then this, what I would say, this complication: does the final triplet support a traditional Puritan view, or is she perhaps giving us an example of the doubt that she expresses? So there's this, there's just this subtlety in there at the very end that you have to kind of read. And also, it's, it takes a little bit to think, oh, okay, not only are there nature images, but there may be biblical in nature as well. So. And I don't think that I, necessarily want to close it off and say, oh, it's, it's only one way or the other. And sometimes some of the best works of literature, to speak of Keats's negative capability, actually, the idea that we can have a work of literature like even this short poem by Bradstreet, in which we're kind of left we're unsure. And if we can allow that, that state of negative capability, and not close things off and say, well, this is the only way to interpret the poem, then that's probably wise for us as readers. It gives more depth to the poem. It gives more respect to Bradstreet and her experience overall. So that is a wonderful way to end this, and hopefully that was a really good sort of movement in there. Again, if you've never been exposed to Bradstreet before, to start with something really simple like the author to her book, which is, and I say simple, but it's a great poem, skillfully crafted, wonderful, technically proficient in heroic couplets. And then the prologue has got this, little hints of feminism in there. Here follows some verses upon the burning of our house. Beautiful, perfectly crafted poem, and one that you can, because it's in iambic tetrameter, one that's easy to use as a model in your own creative writing as well, if you want to. And then the letter is good, and then this probably one of the most powerful poems I think that she has is this, in memory of my dear grandchild Elizabeth Bradstreet. So there we go, and that is the end of this lecture, and a wonderful experience, I believe, with Bradstreet's poetry.